tournament this year, which I believe is the most we've had. We were also thrilled to have every, of the 8 schools we had in quarterfinals, we had 8 different schools represented. So we're very excited to see the health of world schools developing as an event in the state of Indiana. Let me do a quick thank you to the members of the World Schools Committee, which are from Southport High School, Mr. David Lewis, who's standing in the back, and from Westfield High School, Mr. Ralph Robinson. Your judges this afternoon are going to be from Plymouth, Mr. Trent McKenzie, from Hamilton Southeastern, Bob Hinshaw, from Munster, Charlie McConnell, from Brebeuf, sorry, lost my voice, Alicia Dreyer, and from Bloomington South, Candy Brown. Debating today, representing the proposition, will be team J006. J006 representing the proposition. That team consists of Henry Eifert, Andrew De La Salle, Miyanah Perry, Ashelyn Lucas, and Nathan Fiedeldey. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves individually to you when they speak for the first time, so judges know who's speaking. Representing the opposition this afternoon is team Z019. That's Z019 on the opposition. And that team consists of Elia Livovich, Gretta Burke, Owen Cowsert, Cesar Mondragon, and Zoe Swanson. The motion that we will be debating this afternoon is: this House rejects the argument to interpret the Constitution according to the framers' original intent. This House rejects the argument to interpret the Constitution according to the framers' original intent. I'm going to hand this to you, and if you want to pass that down the road so that I'll understand. And with that, we are ready to get started. Judges, I will collect your ballots at the conclusion of the round. I asked this team, when they do their thank yous, if they could limit that to the first speaker. So that would go for both teams. So the first speaker is going to get thank yous out for everybody. Otherwise, yes, sir. Will that be on time? That will not be on time. No, the thank yous will not be on time. And Mr. McKenzie is going to knock to remind you of the protected time at the beginning and ending of speeches. Any other questions from our contestants or from our judges? Perfect. Then we are ready to begin. All right. Before I begin, I'd like to thank our coaches for providing such gracious support and resources for us to be able to have an opportunity to play this. And I believe we introduce ourselves. I'm Andrew De La Salle, first speaker for the proposition. My teammates, are you ready? Yes. Opposition, are you ready? The judges, are you ready?
Can I do a quick moment? Make sure to turn off cell phones if you haven't already done so, please, and thank you. And now we should be ready.
All right. Judges, are you ready once more? We shall begin. If we somehow figured out time travel and brought a man back from 1917, or really any other past era, into our large city, how do you think he would react? He would see the cell phones and cars, the tall, tall buildings, and he would see all different kinds of people. In his time, none of these things existed, and nobody from these past eras would be able to conceive of some of these great connections, of these great advancements that we have made, either in technology, economics, and overall socially. And this comes back to today's debate. When the Constitution was written, the original framers could not have foreseen into the future and predict how society would change. The many different kinds of areas, like, again, technological, cultural, and economic growth are unstoppable, and no one can see how a society would react. So for today's debate, I would like to define a few terms coming from Webster's dictionary. Constitution: the system of fundamental laws and principles of a government, state, society, corporation, etc., written or unwritten, especially pertaining to the United States government. Intent: a purpose or an object or aim. The framer: any of the delegates who participated in the framing of the United States Constitution. An interpreter: to bring out the meaning of, to give one's own conception. So now let's start with my first substantive argument. that even in the early days of the Constitution, the interpretation was already being questioned. I would like to refer the opposition to the story of the creation of the National Bank. Alexander Hamilton was able to use the necessary and proper clause, one that was intended to give flexibility within the government, which actually was able to be transferred into flexibility for the economy. At the time of this creation, the United States was encountering a major source of debt and economic disarray from the Revolutionary War. It was necessary for the people of the country to find a solution to this. Hamilton was able to use his own policies, but especially the creation of the bank, something that the original framers did not intend for by using, and his use of the necessary and proper clause was able to fulfill this. The taxation which was necessary to alleviate these economic issues was able to be reached, and therefore the United States could lift itself out of the debt and economic disarray that it was formerly in. Thus, we can see a prime example of how a looser interpretation of the Constitution can create positive benefits that the framers did not originally intend for. They did not originally intend for or foresee this idea of a national bank on the same way Hamilton created. Thus, we can see once again that the necessary and proper clause, which is intended for flexibility in the government, was able to be used for economic reasons. Therefore, once again, we see how the burden, which I will state right now, the burden of the proposition, which is to demonstrate that the interpretation of the Constitution in modern times is not best accomplished by strictly adhering to the intent of the framers, can be achieved. We see that by adopting a more modern solution, something just a few years after the Constitution was written, Hamilton was able to use his own knowledge and interpretation to justify the creation of a national bank, and once again, we saw a more positive net gain. Now on to our second substantive argument, the idea that the social and cultural values of the original framers no longer represent those of the modern day. I would like to use the analogy of a software update. If you have an old computer like mine, we can see that when a new virus pops up, we must take action to alleviate this sort of threat. Yes, I will take your point.
What do you define as the original intent of the Constitution?
Well, I refer you back to our provided definition of intent, a purpose, object, or aim. And in this case, the original intent of the framers would be a purpose, object, or aim of the original framers, which we also provided a definition for. So back to the analogy, we can see that in order to alleviate these sorts of threats from a computer virus, we would take action. In the same way, we decide to update our own democracy. When we look at the original conceptions of who and who isn't a citizen, we can see that they do not coincide with the original framers. We can see that the original intent was to limit the amount of democracy for the United States to white, landowning males. This is definitely out of sync with today's interpretations, which we have seen major advancements, which I will now go into. Originally, again, we can see that it was meant for men. However, as we've modernized throughout time, we can see that over time, we've been starting to include the idea that women are also essential for participation in our democracy. And the original framing was very restrictive and something that no longer holds up today. We believe that men and women have this equal footing, something that was not necessarily recognized as mainstream at the time of the original framing. Since the United States has decided to open itself up to becoming more progressive, times have changed on who and who cannot participate in democracy. Yes, I will take your point.
Why do you believe specifically that the original framers' interpretation was biased toward only men and not women?
Well, we can see that it was biased towards men and not women because they did not make provisions for allowing women to vote in elections. And additionally, they did not allow for non-whites either. And we actually touch on this in my next few points. The 19th Amendment represents a pivotal change in 1919. The language explicitly says that the right to vote shall not be abridged, denied or abridged by the United States government on the basis of sex. Thus, we are seeing an update. We are actually updating our own computer, in this case, our democracy. suffrage has been an issue long before 1919, in fact. In fact, not even 100 years after the Constitution had been written, in the 1800s, we saw intense debate over women's suffrage. Many activists decided that it was necessary for women to become a part of today's democracy. And thus, the idea that we must interpret the Constitution according to the original intent of the framers, does not follow through. Again, now, aside from looking at explicitly updating our democracy to include women, we see an advancement for men, for non-white individuals. The advancements concerning race in the country was updated through the decision to free the slaves through the 13th Amendment. The original framers did not intend for the powers of the commander-in-chief to be used to free slaves within occupied areas. The motive and mechanism that Abraham Lincoln was able to use to free the slaves. The original intent of the framers was obviously not to end this institution. They actually purposely thought that it would cause more strife and conflict, an assertion that they were correct on. Thus, we can see that by updating our democracy and not adhering to the interpretations of those who wrote it, the original intent of those who wrote it, we can see that this flows to the side of the proposition, as well as the benefits that we saw by using and creating the National Bank. For these reasons and more to come, we urge a vote for the proposition. Thank you. Take your own time.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. I'm Owen Cowsert. I'd like to extend my thank yous out to my team, my coaches, especially my World School partners. Is there anyone not ready? Wonderful. Let's begin. The resolution today states, "This House rejects the argument to interpret the Constitution according to the framers' original intent. We, the opposition, staunchly disagree and accept the arguments to interpret the Constitution according to the framers' original intent." In my first speech, I'm going to do three things. First, I'm going to define some key terms to clarify the round. Then, I'm going to move on to some framing to provide a lens to view the round, before finally getting into our first two substantive arguments, which are that Contention 1, proposition leaves room for abuse of Constitution. Contention 2, amendments. And Contention 3, judicial, which my partners will touch upon. Let's get into some key terms. Defined by the American Heritage Dictionary, the term interpret is defined as to conceive the significance of. Original is defined as preceding all others, or first. And Constitution we define as the United States Constitution. Now for the framing. The proposition must prove that the framers' original intent is flawed. And once we do interpret the Constitution differently, it should pose no problems to the American people and abroad. Also, the opposition house is based and representing the United States. With that, we move into our first argument. Proposition leaves room for abuse of Constitution. An important thing to clear the air is to just tell you exactly what the intent was. The original intent of the framers is to provide the government with a body of laws to allow for the functioning of society and government in the U.S. and abroad. Now that leads us to a logical question: how would we interpret this differently? Who would be interpreting this differently? Let me offer you a couple scenarios. What if the citizens were to interpret the Constitution and its intent? And what if the government was posed to interpret the Constitution and its intent? Both of these are problematic, and I'll tell you why. First, what if the citizens were allowed to interpret the Constitution? Well, first, their interpretations would be purely biased for the citizens themselves. Now, another important thing to keep in mind is that keeping a unified interpretation among the citizens is very unlikely, considering political polarization as a problem that we find ourselves dealing with today. Now, what if the government were to interpret the Constitution? Well, we'll say it's the president. So the commander-in-chief is sitting in his office deciding how to interpret the Constitution. Well, there's problems with this. First, he could first interpret it to purely benefit the government, not necessarily the citizens. Or the commander-in-chief can decide to interpret the Constitution to favor him instead of the other branches of government. The overarching problem with allowing other interpretations of the U.S. Constitution is it breaks the balance between citizens and the government. In our Constitution now, it benefits both the citizens and the government. It's something we keep close to home. We don't want to sacrifice this by allowing potential mischievous interpretations. Contention 2, amendments. A common misconception that you might all think is that the opposition does not allow for innovations or changes to the Constitution. Well, the problem is this is completely false. We have something called amendments. The framers of the U.S. Constitution knew that times would change as the years go on, which is why they purposely intended there to be a system where we make these necessary changes. And these decisions are all made by politicians who are compelled to follow the intent of the framers' interpretations. In conclusion, the United States Constitution was written to provide the government with a body of laws to allow for the functioning of society and government in the United States and abroad. If you believe in leaving no room for abuse in the Constitution, then please vote for the opposition. Thank you.
Suit with the opposition's strategy of introducing this round. Is there anybody who is not ready to begin?
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, yes, right. Well, I'm Henry Eifert. So again, anyone not ready to begin? Then let's get started. So in our second speaker's argument, which will come from myself, we're going to move forward with clarifying the third contention of our argument. And then after I've finished explaining our third contention, we will move forward with rebutting some of the arguments that have been put up by the opposition in today's debate. So let's first move forward with what our third contention is. The Constitution, authored by the original framers, is not the same document we have today, and their conceptions of how it functions are less complete than modern interpretations. That is our contention for a third contention. So, to explain, the Constitution has been modified in ways the original framers could not have anticipated. The way that the Constitution has evolved, and specifically the way that amendments have been added to the Constitution, is not always in line with original interpretations of the original document. That means that the document that we use today, that we call the Constitution, is full of examples in which interpretations that weren't referring directly to the original framers' interpretations have been added. This means that the original framers' intentions for how the Constitution should be interpreted is now incomplete. We argue that efforts to modernize the theory of the original framers, to reflect changing social and cultural values, have produced a document very different from the original. And furthermore, that amendments from the process by which senators are elected, specifically the 17th Amendment, to the limits on presidential terms, the 22nd Amendment, and the Bill of Rights, express changes to the document in line with modern interpretations for the respective times in which they were implemented. These sorts of amendments weren't all made with the assumption that everyone is understanding the document in terms of its original construction. In fact, modern versions of the document for respective times have now been baked into the Constitutions into the Constitution through the amendments themselves. Because today's judicial branch is interpreting a document that has modernized in content, the way they should interpret the Constitution should reflect the modernization of its contents and now be a version of theory which recognizes that modern interpretations of the Constitution are to be preferred from the incomplete original intentions. Modern theories of government account for modern conditions better than the analysis of the original framers. Utilizing modern interpretations means that the social and cultural values of the American people will not be in conflict with the archaic conceptions of social theory held by the original framers. Nor will the judiciary branch be analyzing constitutional law in the context of the intentions of a group of people who did not have access to the Constitution as we know it today. So, as we see the way that we should view the Constitution has updated, we must recognize that as the document continues to progress, we must reflect our interpretations of the Constitution to reflect those advancements. It's important to note that the Constitution is a living document, and that, as I've said previously, modern interpretations of the Constitution for respective time periods in which these amendments were added are now inherent to the document itself. Using only the original intentions of the Constitution, we cannot account for modern interpretations of the Constitution which now are part of the document through amendments. This is a limitation of the opposition's position that we must only be using original intent to analyze the Constitution and determine how we should interpret it. We, the proposition, give you an alternative. We can modernize the way that we view the Constitution to reflect the text that we have today, instead of specifically and exclusively utilizing the interpretations of framers who, again, are not around to see the way that the document has developed. So now we will be moving forward in addressing some of the contentions that the opposition has brought up today in today's debate. First, they argued that the proposition, or us, leaves room for abuse of the Constitution. They argue that the original intent of the Constitution was to create a functional foundation for law. We argue that the original intent of the Constitution is far more complex than this short sentence. When we are talking about the intention of the original framers, we have to talk about what the framers were thinking whilst they were writing the document in different areas. We have to think about what the framers were thinking when they wrote the word citizen in the document when it was originally authored. And we have to understand that today, the version of citizen that we use to describe citizens in that document is entirely out of line with what the original framers intended the word citizen to mean. To give you another example of this, we're going to briefly move outside the Constitution, but to a document that is from a similar time period, the Declaration of Independence. The famous line, "All men are created equal," originally was designed to refer specifically to men. However, modern interpretations of the document have given us the insight that the true American application of this line of text is not to refer exclusively to men, but to refer to all citizens of the United States, and in fact to refer to everyone across the world. That the idea that all men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights by their Creator is not specifically a sentence that should pertain to men in the modern theory, even though the original intent was to view it that way. The rest of the Constitution can be viewed through a similar lens. I'll take your point.
What brought you to the conclusion that all men were created equal was written with the specific intent to be interpreted literally as all men?
Well, frankly, that was the interpretation that the original authors of the Declaration of Independence were using. There's 20 seconds before the next POI. In fact, this particular circumstance in which we're seeing the words "all men are created equal" had much debate at the time between women who wanted an update to include the words men and women. The word men in that time period did emphatically refer to men. And if the original framers had the intent of writing something that was to refer to men and women, we ask the question, why didn't they just update the sentence to include men and women? We must assume that this sentence was written literally, especially with the very limited understanding of social theory and equality and intersectionality that the original framers and authors of the document possessed at the time of its writing. The next argument and the next contention that the opposition brings up is the idea of amendments to the Constitution. They have made the argument that the Constitution has provisions for making amendments, but additionally stated that all of these amendments are made with reference to the original intent of the Constitution, which we say is flat out not true. There are many amendments to the Constitution in the Bill of Rights which use modern understandings of the existing text in the Constitution to justify their existence. Classic examples of this would be the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, all dealing with provisions of slavery and redefining citizenship. In addition, the 19th Amendment, which extended the right to vote to women. All of these are, at the times, interpretations that would have been considered radical. But, in fact, in the modern day, we have to understand that these particular ways of interpreting the document are essential to preserving the image of America that we want. We don't want to regress to a time before the social theory that existed in the modern day was around. We don't want to make changes and, in fact, enact legislature that ignores the current imagining of social and cultural theory that we have today. Rather, we must update the original intentions of the framers of the Constitution and indeed combine our own modern day analysis to specifically allow for this document to function the way that it should be functioning, which is to preserve a just system of law for the people of America. Thank you.
I'm Elia Livovich for the opposition side. Judges ready? Opponents ready? Teammates ready?
Yes.
Okay. Let's begin. Firstly, to begin this speech, I will be going on with the Contention 3 in our case, and then moving on to attack my opponent's speech. To preface my beginning of the contention, I would like to restate that our Contention 1 was that the proposition is leaving room for the abuse of the Constitution through the manipulation of it and taking it out of context within the interpretation of it. And then our second contention was a contention of amendments and explaining how those apply to the Constitution and how they apply to the creators of the Constitution who made amendments possible because they knew that society would change in the future. And judges, that is incredibly important within this round, as my opponents are constantly stating that that the writers of the Constitution had no way to predict the future, and therefore we must interpret the Constitution differently depending on the present that we live in. Please remember this within this round, as I will further disprove that within the speech. Contention 3 is Judicial Branch. The purpose of the Judicial Branch within the United States is to interpret the Constitution in order to benefit the United States as a whole and in its workings. The definition of judicial branch is of or proper to courts of law or the administration of justice from the American Heritage Dictionary. The proposition could lead to injustice in this case because the proposition's manipulation of the Constitution's contents would harm the workings of the judicial system. The intent, as defined in my case, and judges, I will redefine the intent of this resolution because it is incredibly important that we get this right, and it is incredibly important to remember that our opponents have not disagreed with the definition of the creator's intent as we define within our case. And their definition of the intent of the creators is incredibly vague and throughout the rest of this case. Because as they define it as the purpose or aim of the framer, but they give no definition of that purpose. They give no definition of that aim. We, however, as the opposition side, are defining it as to provide the government with a body of laws to allow the functioning of society and government. Continuing on with my Contention 3. In the proposition, as we stated within our Contention 1, the removal of the framer's intent is abusive and would lead to corruption. Specifically in a hypothetical example, if a group of people decide under the proposition's world that they prefer one interpretation of the Constitution over the original framer's intent of the Constitution, they could directly harm the justice of a human being because their view of that would corrupt the system. Remember, the proposition must within the burden on the opposition case that the original intent of the Constitution was flawed, and that if it is changed, it does not harm the citizens domestically and abroad. Our Contention 3 effectively shows why that is not possible through the corruption of the Constitution. This is because the judicial branch is meant to be impartial and to follow the Constitution due to the original framers' intent. In the proposition, the impartiality of the Constitution is decimated because of that manipulated intent. As my opponents are stating, they want to manipulate the intent of the Constitution in correspondence to the present day, in correspondence to how it is now compared to the creators of the Constitution. That is going to manipulate the Constitution to such an extent that it will ultimately corrupt the justice system and will ultimately harm the justice of a human being within the United States. Because of that, judges, it is incredibly important to remember that the burden on the opposition side has not been refuted by the proposition, and it still stands within this debate. And the proposition must prove that they are upholding it. And we must remember the importance of the manipulation of the Constitution and of the intent, and what that definition of intent is. And let me restate that again for you. The intent of the original framers is that they are providing the government with a body of laws to allow for the functioning of society and government. Moving on to attacking my opponent's case. Firstly, I've already discussed the definition of the original framers' intent and do not feel the need to further discuss it within this side. And judges, please just refer to our interpretation of the intent. Moving on to their contention 1 of how earlier when the Constitution was made, the interpretation of it was questioned. They give the example of the National Bank created by Alexander Hamilton and how it is necessary for that bank to become a thing because it used a clause in the Constitution. First of all, this can be still achieved in the opposition side. We are not arguing for changing the Constitution. When Alexander Hamilton created that national bank, it was still the Constitution. It was still the Constitution in its original intent. And remember, the original intent is allowing for the functioning of society and government. Alexander Hamilton created a national bank in order to improve that functioning of society and of the government. That is directly following the Constitution. Because of that, this point flows to the opposition side, because that is actually following the Constitution to a T in almost any sense. Yes?
So would you argue then that any decision which in fact upholds the ability of the Constitution to remain a functioning document for society must therefore be reflecting the original intentions of the framers in all cases?
I believe so, yes, and I'm going to further discuss this within my attacks. So considering the National Bank, judges, that point actually flows to the opposition side within this round. Moving on to the burden that they have placed on the opposition. They say that they must demonstrate the interpretation is not best in the modern times if we are referring to the original intent. However, as we stated within our contention 2, the specific intent of amendments was so that the Constitution could still preserve its original intent of allowing for the functioning of society and government, but to best fit the modern time. That is why our amendments helped with slavery and with the right to vote. That is why we have those amendments in place. They did not change the original intent of the Constitution. They were keeping the original intent of the Constitution in place. Moving on to their contention 2 of social cultural values, firstly, I would like to state that the original framers knew that society would change. They knew that the world would change. They knew it wouldn't stay in the same state of mind that they lived in when they wrote that Constitution. And that is why they allowed the ability for adaptation. That is why amendments exist. This applies to the examples that they provided of voting and of slavery, because those were both common things in that time. But as society progressed, they became taboo and they became awkward. And because of that, we have that amendment to fix that within our society and to further preserve the Constitution. We are preserving the original intent. We are preserving that in the opposition case. I'm moving on to their contention 3 of how the Constitution isn't the same today. That is exactly the point. The Constitution with its amendments are still upholding the original intent. Even if the Constitution originally existed without those amendments, adding those amendments onto it preserved the original intent of it. And because of that, the original intent, which they have not disagreed to, is still being upheld on the opposition side. But as I've shown through my contention 3 and through my attacks on their case, they are actually harming the citizens of the United States. And it's for these reasons that I stand in opposition. Thank you.
Is everyone ready?
Yes.
Awesome. Let's begin.
No, who are you?
Oh, sorry. I'm Nathan Fiedeldey. So, we're good? All right, sorry about that. Let's begin. In this rebuttal, I would like to address some concerns I have with the opposition's contentions. First, I will go through their first and second contention and addressing some more miscellaneous issues that they have brought up during their previous speeches. And then I would like to move on to bolstering our third contention. So, without further ado, let's go to their first contention. The idea that the resolution that we propose leaves room for abuse of the Constitution. This, I must say, is simply not true, especially considering the provisions we have in our modern society. And furthermore, without the ability to change the Constitution, the country would not be able to make crucial changes in order to match our developing society. Take, for example, civil rights, women's suffrage, these such issues. If we were not able to change the Constitution, we would simply not have these benefits in our society. Now, to their concern of abuse, the abuse of the Constitution more specifically, this was tackled very early on in our country's history with Marbury versus Madison, which established judicial review, which checks the legislative branch and prevents the abuse of the Constitution and the abuse of government under power unfavorably over the people of the United States. Therefore, due to the fact, the mere existence of judicial review and Marbury versus Madison, it is clear that any abuse that should arise as a result of these loose construction of the Constitution, any of these concerns will simply be shot down by the Supreme Court, given their power in judicial review. Therefore, it seems as if their first contention is simply null due to the mere existence of judicial review. Now, moving to their second contention, that amendments allow for adaptation. This is true. However, the idea that the framers foresaw and created provisions that allow for changes in the Constitution, which they have stressed very heavily, that mere existence of this provision, this ability for them to foresee that we will need to change our Constitution at some point, is indicative of the fact that as society changes, the legislature must change as well. Now, because of its adaptive properties, the adaptive properties of the Constitution, and the benefits of the modern view of the Constitution, it is illogical to use the outdated framers' views to solve modern problems. Therefore, this point flows to the side of the proposition. Moving on. It has been claimed by the opposition that, quote unquote, roughly, the proposition never gave a definition for the framers' intent. However, this is wrong for two main reasons, one of which is rather obvious. It is clear that through two viewpoints, the mere existence of the laws that the framers enacted, and second, the text in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the intent of the framers is quite evident. I mean, they literally wrote it down, and they enacted laws that match their beliefs. Therefore, it is fairly obvious what exactly the framers intended to do with their power. Therefore, we have defended our definition of framers' interests. Now, I would like to address the claim that they have provided, that they have stated that you must provide laws that are just for society. We agree. We agree that laws should be not only created.
What do you believe, you keep speaking on the intent of the Constitution, what do you believe is the intent? Not just the definition of why they wrote it, but the definition of that intent.
The intent of the framers is evident in what they did. The laws they enacted, the lack of freedom for African Americans who were previously held under slavery, the lack of women's suffrage, such voting rights, they simply didn't exist. So it's clear that, at least in the majority of the framers' perspective, those people should not have had those rights. Therefore, that is what the framers intend. Now, back to my point. In order to provide properly for a modern society, it is imperative that we use a modern understanding of the Constitution. To do this, we must use our modern understanding to create laws that properly apply to modern society. If we use outdated 200 years ago, 250 years ago, ideas of what we should do in society, we simply won't be able to match these ideas with the challenges that modern society will be facing. Now, I would like to return to our third contention to further bolster it. Now, back when our country was founded, we began with 7 articles of the Constitution and 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights. Now, we have 27 amendments, being introduced all across time, across different American cultures. And through this time, the interpretation of the various parts of the Constitution changed as well. So when we look back at the older amendments, we see many interpretations. Now, as we have lived under the amendments and have seen the benefits and flaws, our understanding adapts to whichever interpretation is most favorable to our current society. Therefore, our modern adaptation is far more favorable to our modern society. This interpretation often contradicts the framers' interpretation, and for these reasons, I believe that the modern interpretation should supersede the framers' interpretation, given that we have all this additional knowledge, all this additional experience, and we have lived under the very laws that they have enacted. And of course, we have learned from this process, and are now wiser and able to make better laws as a result. Now, just as an example, point natural.
What do you define as a modern interpretation of the Constitution underneath the proposition lies?
Well, the laws that, well, frankly, our interpretation is very vast, considering that the framers have produced a large amount of work. Now, because of this, what we were saying is, as my teammate brought up, the idea that all men are created equal, back during the 1790s, men referred only to literal men. And then later on, as women's suffrage became more popular, men stood for humanity, men and women, well, sorry, just men and women. And then, of course, now, we prescribe the term men to all people. This is just one of the examples of our development of even the same word over the course of time. Now, as another example, the framers never intended for things like the civil rights movement to occur. They really had no vision that that would, well, they did have a vision that that would happen, but they didn't foresee, or they did not approve of it, at least in their actions, which do represent their intentions. And in order to have these things, these movements occur, the social trends must develop as well, which of course should be reflected in our laws. Now, and of course in our legal precedents. Thus, it is clear that the benefits of modern interpretation outweigh the benefits of maintaining/using the framers' intent. They simply could not have predicted solutions to the problems of the 21st century, and for these reasons and more, we stand in firm affirmation of today's resolution. Thank you.
My name is Swanson. Judges ready? Opponents ready? Okay, let's begin. To start off, we need to focus on the resolution. Because the resolution says to reject, we have to assume that the proposition's interpretation would not align with the framers' intent. They continue to bring up that the intent is somewhat like what we were saying, but they have to reject the framers' original intent. Moving on to the first contention of, even in the early days, interpretation was being questioned. They brought up the example of the national bank. However, there was a clause within the Constitution that allowed for flexibility, which allowed for the creation of the national bank. The original framers of the Constitution acknowledged that society would change with time, and in this way, the laws would have to change with it. Because of this, they allowed for the creation of the national bank. Although it didn't say specifically the creation of the national bank, this was part of the Constitution. It allowed for flexibility. The Constitution is a set of base laws to provide a system to the United States. The creation of the national bank was in the interest of the United States as well. And citizens in the government become imbalanced if we are taking it out of context. This is not taking it out of context. Yes.
Was it the original intent of the framers of the Constitution for the necessary and proper clause to be used to establish a national bank? And if not, how is this not a modern interpretation of the Constitution for the time?
The original framers' intent was to allow the Constitution, which was a set of laws, to move with society. It said in the Constitution that we allow for amendments and we allow for changes because society changes with the laws. And so if we kept the laws stagnant, this would be problematic. However, the laws are allowed to be changed because of the Constitution. The Constitution allows for amendments. And so in this way, yes, it did allow for the creation of the national bank. Moving on to their second contention of the values that are no longer present. The values of the past are no longer present, represent the values of today. They brought up that the purpose of the Constitution is its intent. they never explained what the intent of the Constitution was. They never explained what the framers' original intent was. They continue to just say the purpose of the Constitution is its intent. The intent is the purpose. They never actually explain what it is. They just say it's too complicated, we can't explain. And so because they do not do this, we gave a intent of the Constitution. We said that this is a baseline of laws for the government to enact that allows for society to function. And included in the Constitution is the ability to amend the Constitution, to allow it to change with society. So in this way, this still goes with the Constitution. And so they brought up the examples of amendments, but these amendments are within the Constitution. The Constitution allows for changes. The writers knew that society would change with time, so this is why this happens. Also, we have amendments because we need to allow society to change along with laws. Moving on to their third contention, the original Constitution is not the same as it is today. Again, the framers intended for there to be changes. They didn't intend for the same Constitution to be from when it was created to now. They intended for there to be changes, however, they did not intend for it to be taken out of context. Our opponents are arguing for it being taken out of context, for it being interpreted in different ways. This is problematic. A big thing in this round is the idea of societal change and modernization. The Constitution allows for amendments, so because of this, amending the Constitution is one of the intents of the framers. The opponents said that the framers' intent is obvious, and we can see it based on the laws of the time. They gave no clear intent, however, ours is timeless. They also said that using only original intentions, we cannot account for modernization. This is simply not true. Our opponents also agreed with our intent. And moving on, they brought up the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, saying that these were problematic because they did not go with the framers' original intent because the framers did not believe that at the time. However, the framers were not racist or sexist. They just knew that the Constitution would be rejected by people of society because it would differ from societal norms. Because of this, if they knew that this would be problematic, however, they allowed for amendments. They allowed for the Constitution to be changed so that the laws of the land could be changed with societal changes. Because the resolution says reject, we have to assume that they completely disagree with the framers' intent. Although our opponents give many arguments in favor of taking the Constitution out of context, we have shown the negative effects of doing so. If we take the Constitution out of context, then there is room for abuse of the Constitution. This allows for the Constitution to be taken completely out of context and used in an abusive way that leads to injustice. We need to value justice, and in order to do that, we have to make sure that the Constitution is not taken out of context and is not interpreted in a way differing from the framers' original intent. Also, because the Constitution allows for amendments, we recognize that the framers intended for it to be changed, and they intended for society to allow for changes in the Constitution, that changes in society would lead to changes in laws. So this goes with our point. Our opponents keep saying that amendments are beneficial and that these are differing from our side, but this point of amendments is on the opposition side. For the third contention, judicial branch, the purpose of the judicial branch is to interpret the Constitution in order to benefit the United States. If we are taking the Constitution out of context, this leads to injustice. If we are putting the possibility of people taking the Constitution completely out of context, which is a very likely possibility, and that's what the proposition is arguing for, then we can find a lot of injustice and a lot of abuse within society. In order to protect the citizens of the United States and the people of the world, we need to vote for the opposition. Thank you.
Is everyone ready? Let's begin. This round has been a little crazy back and forth, but I'll sum it up pretty simply. This round comes down to two key voting issues that you guys must take into account for when you cast your ballot. First, the Constitution, to steal from them, is a living, breathing document. As we talked about before, it was intended by by the framers that the Constitution would change as the will of the people changed. This is why we have the amendment system. This is what I explained in my entire second contention. The process in which the amendments are changed deals a lot with the original framers' intent. See, as I explained before, the people who make the decisions to change the Constitution have to follow the framers' original intent. They are compelled. The second voting issue is the fact that we don't know how the Constitution will be interpreted. Last speech, my partner brought up something very, very important. The resolution states, this House rejects the argument to interpret the Constitution according to the framers' original intent. Keyword, rejects. This should be assumed that the proposition would reject the framing of the original framers. Let me just remind you of the original framing. The intent of the Constitution's framers is to provide the government with a body of laws to allow for the functioning of society and government in the U.S. and abroad. So that leads us to the question that I posed in my first contention. How will it be interpreted? Well, the citizens, the government, they both propose terrible problems. And with voting for the proposition, you're left with the unsurety of knowing how the Constitution will be interpreted. Voting for the opposition at least gives you a stable idea that if you want a problem to be fixed or if times change, there is a process that the Founding Fathers intended and interpreted, and that's the amendment system. So in conclusion, the intent of the Founders is timeless. They interpreted the Constitution to be changing as the world changes. Thus, many people are left in the vague idea of how will this be changed. Now, if you want a decision where the Constitution will be interpreted straightforward, then please vote for the opposition. We understand that the world's changing. We understand that things need to be changed. And so did the Founding Fathers, which is why, again, they had the amendment system. So please, as my final speech as a debater, vote for the opposition. Thank you.
In case you missed it the first time, my name, again, is Henry Eifert. So, once again, is there anyone who is not ready to begin? In that case, let's get started. So, for our final rebuttal and personalization speech, we are going to be addressing 4 main points of contest within today's debate and demonstrating why it is that each of these particular examples are going to flow towards the proposition's arguments. First, we're going to begin with the question of what does the original intent of the framers mean? The opposition argued that the exclusive intention of the original framers was to preserve functional government. This is far too limited a definition, which we explained in our second speaker's speech, which came from myself. Imagine a Supreme Court justice interpreting the Constitution only on the grounds of preserving functional government. It's far too limited a definition for what the true original intentions of the framers were. I provided you the definition that the original intent of the framers was in fact what they were thinking whilst they were writing the document. That is the original intent of the framers, and it's what we're comparing to when we ask the question of whether their interpretation is best for analyzing the document in modern times. Any modern interpretation would be automatically counterproductive if we were to use this incredibly manipulative definition provided by the opposition. Any, because any modern interpretation, by their definition, would have to not want to preserve functional government. It's far too limited and unfair for a definition. We provided a counter, and they never accepted the counter definition we provided. So, moving on to the next question which we'll be dealing with, which is to deal with the interpretation of the Constitution and how it deals with today's problems. So the question is, which interpretation of the Constitution is best equipped to deal with today's problems? They argue that the original framers is, because they were using the simplistic definition that all of their intents, their exclusive intent, was to preserve functional government. We demonstrated that the original framers were unaware of today's social theory, so their analyses are incomplete for the modern day. We explained why this is true in significant detail, but it was entirely dropped by the opposition. They, in fact, claimed that the original framers were neither sexist nor racist in the slightest, which we believe is absurd. There are some evidence pieces in today's debate which are simply facts, and we are going to rest that you are also aware of the fact that the original framers of the Constitution were racist and sexist. They were products of their time. The third question for today's debate is, does the Constitution's ability to change by adding amendments negate the need for modern interpretation? The opposition argues that any amendment would necessarily use the framers' original intent without backing this up in the slightest, whilst we said that, in fact, amendments can be added to the Constitution which use interpretations that differ from the original intentions of the document's original authors. They are completely ignoring this point. They dropped it entirely, so this must flow to our side. There's another crucial error here. Essentially, what they are arguing is that the original framers intended for the Constitution to be interpreted through a modern lens. The argument clearly flows to our side because what the opposition is claiming is that the original framers' intent was for us to interpret the Constitution through modern lenses, through the modern versions of our time, and thus that's what amendments should be. While we disagree with this characterization of amendments, it certainly flows to our side of the debate. So, to answer the final question, have we, the proposition, fulfilled our burden to show that the framers' original intentions are not best equipped for interpreting the modern times? Well, because of our contentions that claimed or stated that the original framers did not have adequate understandings of social theory, that they in fact could not have predicted the ways that certain clauses like the necessary and proper clause were utilized by modern government, and finally, that in fact, apologies. That the Constitution authored by original framers is not the same document that we use today, we can clearly see that we must support the position of the proposition in today's debate. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.